Alrighty. Woo! You guys. Bear Market, it's nice to see you there. So I just got off a plane like an hour ago. I'm super sick. I spent the last probably 280 days away on flights, and that's kind of like the start of everything, right? Like it's everyone says, you know, entrepreneurship is amazing and it's cool, and my Instagram has nice beaches, but it's also like very lonely. You know, and it's very stressful, and you're managing many people and problems and lawsuits, and the best days of your life and the worst days of your life, and you know, and everything boils down into this fabulous life of being an entrepreneur. And so I'm going to kind of walk you through a little bit of my experience being an entrepreneur and the funds and the highs and the lows, and why I'm here today. So the last about year and a half I've spent in about 100 or so countries in the last year. As of last year, right after Davos, we actually started writing regulations for Bermuda that ended up becoming the first legislated and drafted set of regulations for the world for the crypto space. And from then until now, we've been working extensively with the OECD as well as the G7 and G20 to make sure that those regulations are actually brought in to be more universalized for the majority of nations around the world today. And that's a lot of work. And that's kind of really been more of a side project than actually, you're not making revenue off of that, right? So you also have to manage businesses. And so this whole journey kind of started actually back in 2010. I was finishing third year computer science in Vancouver at Simon Fraser University. And my friends, it was third year, it was our last actually final exam. My friends are sitting there and they're coding and whatnot after our exam. I'm like, why the hell are you guys still here? Like, go spend it with your families. Like, get here. And they're like, oh, we're working on this thing. It's called the Bitcoins. And I'm like, what the fuck are the Bitcoins? Pardon my French. And so I sat down, like, this is the stupidest thing in the world, like, this is like just ridiculous. And so I got into it, I spun up my first client, and at that time it was probably like version, 0.8, not even like version 1.0, I don't think. And so then we started mining, and in about, I'd say 3.5 weeks to a month, we mined about 15,000 Bitcoin. And in about 6 months, and these are all on our laptops, they are MacBooks. So people ask, like, what price did you buy Bitcoin at? It was like the equivalent cost of like my university's electricity, and so like kind of like free. And like I got my like MacBook from student loans, so like it was totally free. It was awesome. And so yeah, so we mined for about 6 months, and we're like, oh, this is really cool. And then in about 2011, we were in the first crash. Right, so Bitcoin skyrocketed in our first bubble to $30, and then we basically were like, oh my god, $30, just sell everything, it'll never go back to this again. And that was like the first bubble, and so now I'm happy to say,
sold everything?
Well, no, we didn't, but we couldn't. We tried to, and we literally couldn't even if we wanted to. There was just no market, right? And so that was like our first foray into like bubbles, right? And it was a cool experience. And then so, we kind of actually all drifted apart, so it was me and 4 friends initially. And so about a year after that, I actually moved to the Peruvian Amazon. So I spent about a year living with a tribe of natives in the heart of the jungle, lived on less than $5 a day. It was actually really funny because most of them had no electricity, they didn't even wear like shirts, women were walking around totally naked, and they didn't even have like roofs over their head, but they all had satellite dishes and mobile phones. And it was like kind of weird, like I don't know what they even do with satellite dishes, it's in like a mud hut. But they also had a Western Union, right? And this is kind of where things started to all take place, like especially in my head, was we had this thing, this was this weird white paper, and my nerdy friends at home that were working on IRC channels. And at the same time, like I was sitting in the realities of people that had nothing. I understood what it meant to be financially included or not. And it was kind of like this really impactful time, and the biggest moment when it happened was when my parents had to send me money because my debit card is so broke. And so they used the mud hut, like that had a little sign on it that was like hammered in that said Western Union. And it was like 20%, like it took like a week to get there. It was a total, like, it was just weird. The experience was weird, and coming from here, it's a totally different world. And so it was kind of like at that moment I was like, well, what if you could let these mobile phones to do with satellite dishes, blockchain working on satellites, so I guess that now is all coming together. But mobile phones and this idea of this payment network that could actually be enabled by the web, right? And if you could make these things somehow like merge together, like you could actually solve the people's that I was living with problems. And so that was like the first kind of like eureka moment, like this is wild, crazy, total out of it. And this was in early 2012, like late 2011, 2012. And then so I like called my parents. I'm like, all right, listen, like I need to get a job. And so I came to Toronto. So from Vancouver, I moved to Toronto. And so in early 2013, I moved to a company called Extreme Labs. And so we were the largest mobile application developers in the world. So we were working on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all the bank applications. We invented BBM. Most people know that. So we were in this like really cool emerging kind of time where mobile was starting to eat the world. And it was this high, vibrant time, and Jenny was there with me. Got stuck with that redhead right there. Been with them ever since in many capacities. And so it was just kind of like this really cool vibe, and to understand what it was like to have this emerging technology and all these people driving towards this mission, right out of the jungle, total 360, right into Toronto, into this really cool moment in tech. And then towards the end of 2013, Bitcoin all over the news, skyrocketing to $6, $7, $8, $9, $1,000. And I was like, holy shit, sorry again for my French. But I have a lot of these, called my parents. I was like, where are my hard drives? They were moving this weekend. Took my next flight out, went right back, held them on for dear life, and like the rest is kind of history. But I'll still walk you through that history. So, got back on a plane, came back to Toronto. We got acquired about probably 4 months after that. And then I basically left and just said, what am I going to do with my life? Like, let's immerse ourselves into this, not even nascent, this was like, pre-anything of an industry. And so I called up my friend Jaron, who was at CoinCenter. And there was about 3 guys at CoinCenter at the time. They just started the exchange in New York about like 4 months before. And so I was just helping them, however I could help, however I could be a part of it. And that was kind of on the side, and at the same time we had this kind of group of about 5 of us from Extreme Labs who were all sitting around every week. We'd meet up in my apartment. We just sit and talk about ideas, and just write down ideas of what we could do and everything. And this was probably towards the end of 2014 or midway through. We all said, okay guys, we don't really know what we're doing, but we're just gonna start and build something. We're gonna try to build something, a mobile wallet. Let's try and start doing it. So we started running down this path, a mobile wallet. Tried to raise money, have no idea what we're doing, and don't forget, at the time, this is right after Gox, and so Gox just ruined everyone, and so we're in the second bear market, that's it. Kind of the third, but we'll say second. And so as we were kind of all together, we would just continuously try to just solve problems and think and try to fix things, and on the side, I was starting to really help CoinCenter a lot more and more. And there was an exchange called CA Vertex that was kind of our biggest exchange at the time here in Canada. That was, let's say, a bit of a mess, as most early crypto projects were. It was scaling really quickly, but and its kind of resemblance of the time, no one really knew at the time what we were all doing. We were all just kind of doing things. And of course, that was representative. CA Vertex got into a big financial problem. It got hacked, and this was after Mt. Gox. And so Jared calls me up and goes, hey dude, what are we doing, what's going on? I'm like, not much. In Canada, there's this big opportunity. It's our biggest exchange. It's a total disaster. Let's acquire it. And so this was probably the first acquisition in the space done by any exchange to anything at the time. And so I was helping him on that. I became the director of CoinCenter for Canada. And that was just a whole onslaught of challenges. Our banking was $20,000 a month. When we could get it. We were getting called by the FBI on a weekly basis on investigative transactions on Silk Road. And I'm by the way, I'm 28, as of 2 months ago, so we're 24, and we have no idea what we're doing. And at the same time, we get a call from the FBI, okay? A little bit strange, and it's again resembling of the space, because the space is the opposite of what you look for when you're an entrepreneur. It is literally a combination of the hardest problems. You're fighting financial systems, highly ingrained and entrenched institutions. You're dealing with complex new technologies that transcend borders, with, of course, money launderers and very bad actors. Quadriga is, of course, big in the news today. I was actually doing, in 2013, I was moving $1 million transactions with the founders of Quadriga, and for better and for worse, and those guys are not good guys. But again, in the space, you know, things happen, and the earliest people are generally very rude. And so, you know, I'm trying to help with that today. But so basically what was happening is we were basically acquiring the exchange, and Paycase was starting to kind of take a life of its own as well. And it came back to this idea that we had in the jungle, which was like, what if we could actually take a process that was a problem locally that also would impact people globally, which is the idea of remittances, right? And the idea that if we could just reduce the cost of moving transactions to the, you know, the lowest income bracket in the world, who primarily uses Western Union, you know, we could actually solve a problem on the technology that is Bitcoin and how it kind of functions in that time today. And so that's kind of where we started. It was the hardest thing to raise money for. We'd walk into rooms with investors and literally be called morons, get thrown out of rooms. Like, it was just the hardest thing ever. Like, it was to the point in 2014 and 2015 where not only did no one believe anything this space would ever accomplish, we were called lunatics, stupid, blah, blah, blah. We were like sharing pasta between like founders, like we could barely pay for rent, like maxing out parents' credit cards, whatever it took, right? So like, and this is like one of the biggest lessons that I learned is like two things, like you never stop moving, but you can only start moving if you believe and have so much conviction in what you're doing that like it doesn't matter, right? Like it was never about the money, and it never is, right? And I think, and I commend all of you being in the bear market and sitting in this room today, because like this is the whole thing, right? Like this space right now is in a very dark situation, but it's where you have, or at least I have, the most conviction. It's where I believe it even more, because the people that are here because we believe that we can build things to change the world and make it better. And that's kind of the way that the philosophy I've always taken. And so we were never able to raise money on Paycase, at least for the first 2 or 3 years. It was always so hard, but we were always discovering these new things, right? We were always moving forward and always changing and always kind of, you know, repositioning to try to make things work. And then I was kind of looking at the other side where I was partially running this exchange, which was doing very well for the time in which it was, but I was also learning the ins and outs of how much the systems that be in the legacy infrastructure does not want us to succeed. Right? It was to the point where at one point we had the cost for us to do banking increase to about $60,000 a month. And like, no matter how many transactions you're doing, it is just like, that is the worst business ever. That's nothing to do with operations, people, compliance, technology, infrastructure. Like, it was just insane. And so what happened in 2016, we made the decision to sell the business to Kraken. And Jesse's pal is a good friend of mine, basically came in and said, listen guys, we're going to acquire the user base of this exchange. And then, you know, by the time I was 26, we went through our first kind of real acquisition that was really kind of something of our own. It was an interesting experience. And then kind of things started to shift. So towards 2016, and Paycase and all of us is kind of like a brotherhood. We're all just kind of trying to build new problems, trying to figure things out. And then so as the next kind of wave started happening in 2016, is where things really started to get interesting. We had a lot more business. We had a lot more kind of focus that was not just on, you know, only remittances. And what we learned about remittances is that Bitcoin alone doesn't solve the problem, because you need banking and you need all of these things like regulatory clarity to actually be there, or else it doesn't matter how cheaply I can move, you know, a nanny's money from here to the Philippines. Like, if there's no support and infrastructure from a legal perspective, then it's irrelevant, right? And if there's no banks that will ever accept your money, then how do you even do anything? And so what Paycase started to do, and Paycase today is about 8 subsidiaries. They span from, we advise governments and central banks, and one of them called Paradigm. The other one is Shift, that's working on identity standards and frameworks and KYC and a broad base of other kind of regulatory frameworks on it from a network perspective. And so all these things started actually coming to life and evolving simply out of solving our own problems. We're like, okay, so remittance isn't going to work on its own. What do we need to do? We need to get into trading in OTC because we need liquidity. Okay, so Paycase started working on OTC. I was just doing it as a person, but so then we started evolving into that kind of realm. The next one is Shift. Compliance, KYC is a huge problem. None of our exchanges will get banking. Banks say, oh, it's because of the KYC thing. Let's work on systems and protocols that would solve this from an architectural perspective for the space. Okay, what's next? Well, then a really cool thing happened in about end of 2017, where someone from the TMX group basically came to us and said, you know, the space was starting to really roar, things were starting to move, and the institution, which is one of the biggest in kind of, you know, the country, basically wanted to start stepping into this space. And then so it took us about 7 months to complete that kind of deal, but effectively we announced in March 2018 the first institutional deal with the TMX group, as well as the most important part. It's actually not even TMX that's the most important, is the one thing that everyone in the space has been trying to get since we started, a bank. Right? And so Bank of Montreal basically came in as the first bank in the country to publicly start to actually open up accounts for PayCase. Today we are probably one of only 2 or 3 in the country. But it was like the pinnacle moment where the access to the simplest thing, which is financial services, became possible. And you don't realize how much it matters to have something as simple as like a checkings account or like a deposit account.
Can you tell that story about how you got that check but you couldn't?
Oh yeah. Well, so no, that was the big thing. Yeah. So we were actually given checks by our partners to basically actually start building and working on certain projects that we have within the exchange. And it was the funniest part where like we went in and we're like, well, how do we actually even deposit this because we don't have the accounts to do it? And so they're sitting there being like, oh, wait a minute. This is kind of a big problem, like, this isn't going to work so well. And so that's actually how the bank actually had to come into the entire thing, because we're like, we can't even do the things that you want us to do. And it's so simple, right? It's a check and just an account, but it's not. But I mean, it's all these things kind of combined, like kind of start to really give the space a lot of kind of depth and a lot of, you know, the early muscle that you need to start to really accelerate. And so, yeah, so basically the institutional experience is one that we've been dealing with for the last kind of year and a half, and it's not easy. These are totally different worlds than what we're used to, but it's a very important step in the broader context and the history of kind of like where the space is going. And so that's kind of like a very interesting thing for us. And so as we kind of started to move past that, the question was, you know, what would be the ultimate solution to solve all these problems, right? Like, we learned a lot from being in Canada, but I think like the one thing that the space is and what's really important is that we are not a local space. My best friends don't live in this country with the exception of a few, like they live in every other country, right? And it's really because the people that you're fighting with on your left and on your right, you know, we're doing and facing the same problems everywhere, right? It's truly global. And so the one thing that we recognized was that what would be the most impactful thing that we could do for the next 2 to 3 years that would have a much order of magnitude larger impact, which is to deal with the more global regulatory question. And that's really how Bermuda started all coming to play. And Bermuda isn't meant to be the country that solves the world's problems, but what it was a quick and simple place where you could do things fast and prove to the world that these things are not only possible, but they're actually logical and they actually come out with a better solution than what the traditional world has today. And so it's acts as this test bed that we're starting to do a lot of interesting things. And more importantly is that it was quietly actually being done with the OECD behind us. Right? So the OECD basically is worked very closely with us to say, we are going to create policy requirements from this ecosystem, but we need examples by which you start with. And if you can really get those you know, that hard use case down, then we can start to universally adopt these things and do it in a way that makes sure this ecosystem is still alive. Because that's the biggest fear, right? Like, the one thing that I was worried about 2 years ago was the moment that people are writing our rules in our future and they don't have a clue what it's like to sit and stand right here or what it's like to actually be involved in it is the moment that we all die, right? And so we needed to make sure that that was, you know, hedged effectively. And so I think that largely that's happened. I mean, let's not talk about the US, that place is a whole other ball game. But largely, I think what you'll see over the next 2 years is the infrastructure and kind of the regulatory frameworks that were built and are being built today under these kind of countries will start to actually become the standard infrastructure for the majority of the world. And like the number one thing in our space that we need is regulatory clarity, because that allows banking. It allows all this infrastructure that we kind of had to like hack job in right? Saying, oh, this bank will give us this, and we kind of have a framework here, and oh, this will kind of work because reg kind of works here. You need this stuff to all be universalized, because once that happens, everyone here's business flourishes. And that's what I also like about this bear market. It's like the best time. I love bear markets, don't you guys? It's good. You gotta learn to embrace it, right? Like pardon?
Why?
Why? Because it wakes us up. Like, the reality is the last year, maybe that's the first question. I think that like, we don't get a lot done when markets are in the other one. Like, you know, we party like it's 1999, you know, and it's like dot-com bubble. I mean, it's fun, and Rob Pierce runs around, and you know.
Yeah.
But it's not like we're not getting stuff done, and it's not realistic. You know, like we're spending money like it doesn't matter because at the time it doesn't. But like this really sobers everyone up, and it shows you who is still in the room when the room shouldn't even exist, right? And I mean, like the old saying is like you invest in bear markets because that's when the next wave of billionaires are made, right? Like if you look at every person who's been successful in this space today, is that they were very, very much convicted in the last bear market. And you know, I'm not saying it's all the money because it's not. I mean, I'm sick as hell, and I almost didn't come here today, but I did because I know that always showing up to the place that I love, which is this ecosystem, which is what we build, is what makes me get out of bed, right? And like having to continue to be involved in this is like what's important. So I don't know if that's a good end of the story, but.